His doctrine is called Marcionism. He published the earliest record of a canon of New Testament books. And so his canon didn't include the Old Testament, because as it says there, he believed that this vengeful God of the Old Testament. For Gnostics, the good thing about people, about all of us, is the spiritual stuff. It's like the non-material stuff that's inside of you. That's what goodness is, you know? And all of our ills come from this material world. And we're constantly in this battle between the material world and our like spiritual selves. And if you think about the fact that, you know, somebody wants to have a loving relationship, but they're addicted to pornography. It's like the soul versus the material like body. You know, somebody wants to be the best and most productive person they can be, but they're too lazy and they can't be bothered to hit the gym or whatever. And it's like a physical impairment on the things that they want to achieve, you know? And so all of the bad stuff comes from the existence of the material world. It's not just Gnostics who think this, by the way. There are all kinds of philosophical views throughout history that sort of posit the material and the spiritual as kind of in battle with each other.
Yes.
Or more broadly, maybe just the good and the bad. There are like good forces and bad forces, and they're in like a battleground on earth. For the Gnostics, and Gnosticism is a broad term. A lot of scholars think it shouldn't be used because it describes so many varying views. But broadly speaking, you could say that you've got material world, bad, spiritual world, good. And that we have essentially, as spiritual beings, that's what our soul is, we have been trapped in a material world. That material world has been created by an evil or an incompetent, like, creative being, sometimes called the demiurge. And that the ultimate goal of life is to escape from that material trapping and regain our place in the spiritual realm.
So the material world is where we're then forced to experience pain, suffering to varying degrees that ends inevitably in death because we're in a place that we spiritually should not be.
That's right, yeah. And we shouldn't be here at all. So for Gnostics, the creation of the world is essentially a cosmic disaster.
Disaster.
Something went wrong. And if you read some of this Gnostic literature, which we only really rediscovered in the 20th century, like this is new. You know?
Why did we rediscover it in the 20th century?
So we've known for a long time. And by the way, I'm talking in the context of Christianity here, right?
Okay.
So Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And so in mainstream Christianity, the thing that saves you is the sacrifice of Jesus. Yeah. Jesus dies on the cross and he resurrects, and that's why you're saved. For the Gnostic Christians, it's not really about what Jesus did. It's about having the right knowledge. Jesus brought knowledge, and if you know the right stuff, that's what will save you.
Meaning you can access that within you.
Yeah, so it's very like inward looking.
Yes.
It's very knowledge based. Like some of these Gnostic Gospels don't even mention the crucifixion or the resurrection, or they have a different interpretation on what was going on there. And so within the Christian tradition, the Gnostics believe that the thing that's important is knowledge. And so they have their own sort of scriptures, and these are like later than the books we have in the New Testament, and they're condemned as heretical. So the sort of early Christian church.
Which books are you talking about, to be specific?
So in the New Testament we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right?
That's right.
There do exist other Gospels. The Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas.
Philip, right?
The Gospel of Philip, yes. And also other like letters.
Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, and some of them are much more tenuous than others. There are some really interesting, obvious forgeries, for example. But you've also got like apocalyptic literature. So like the Apocalypse of Peter, which is incredibly interesting. I think there are actually 2 of those. And there's all these texts that people are writing. And at some point in the early church, you've got these texts floating around, and you've also got people claiming to be Paul the Apostle and writing letters in his name, and they're not really written by him and stuff. And so at some point people decide we should start putting together some kind of scriptural canon. Interestingly, the first person to give this a go that we know of is called Marcion. Marcion, yeah. And Marcion decides to
God, you say everything's way cooler than that. So I'm like, Martian? Marcion.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, he's cool and Gnostic, but it's a little unclear as to exactly what his views are, because he doesn't have this crazy cosmic theology. But the one thing that he does have that's Gnostic is he thinks, like he reads what we now call the Old Testament. So he reads like the Hebrew scriptures, and he reads about a God who is like a bastard. He's like committing genocide and slavery, and he's jealous, and he's punishing people and all of this kind of stuff. And then he reads these texts that have begun to emerge, which eventually become the New Testament, these Gospels, and he's like, this Jesus figure is kind, and he's about love and all of this kind of stuff. So for Marcion, he decides, I'm going to put together a biblical canon. The entire Old Testament is omitted. It's not in there.
Why did he make that? Just because Jesus wasn't there at the time?
Because he reads the Gospels and he's like, okay, Jesus is our guy. Jesus is this God figure, this spiritual being that we're all approximating. And when he reads the Hebrew scriptures, he doesn't recognize that God in those scriptures. He thinks this God is evil. This God looks to be a monster. And so this cannot be the God that I'm worshipping through Jesus. It has to be something else. So Marcion thinks that the God of the Old Testament is this demiurge I mentioned earlier, this evil creator of the material world. The material world is bad. The God described in the Old Testament is the creator who brought about the material world, evil guy. So all of the Old Testament is gone. And all that we have left is like a slightly shortened version of the Gospel of Luke, and I think 10 out of 13 of Paul's letters that ended up in the New Testament. So the first attempt at a Christian Bible actually just excludes the Old Testament on these grounds, that the Old Testament God is evil and incompetent.
I never heard that before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, you've pulled it up there. It'll probably say something about compiling the... so he considered himself a follower of... Marcion preached that God had sent Jesus Christ, who was distinct from the vengeful God, brackets demiurge, who had created the world. He considered himself a follower of Paul the Apostle, whom he believed to have been the only apostle of Jesus Christ. His doctrine is called Marcionism. He published the earliest record of a canon of New Testament books. And so his canon didn't include the Old Testament, because as it says there, he believed that this vengeful God of the Old Testament is an evil being. There's a text that he wrote. I forget what it's called. There was some text that he wrote which we don't actually have anymore, but it just compared the Old Testament God and Jesus. It just like lists out things that the Old Testament God does and things that Jesus does. And
we don't have it anymore.
We don't have it
meaning
anymore.
It got destroyed or lost.
For whatever reason, we don't have it. It might have been destroyed. It might have been lost, but we have it through the works of his enemies. So like people were responding to him at the time. And so we know what's in there because people were writing about it. And so we know that Marcion is comparing the Old Testament God with Jesus and saying, this doesn't line up. This doesn't line up at all. God is saying an eye for an eye. Jesus is like subverting that and saying turn the other cheek.
Right.
God is committing genocide. Jesus is saying love your neighbor. All of this kind of stuff. And so he just concludes that this Old Testament God is evil and bad and terrible. So that's the earliest like attempt at a Christian canon that we get. But like the early church that develops and becomes the Christian church that we know today takes a different view. It believes that the Hebrew scriptures are legitimate, and it lands on these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as the four Gospels that people should be reading. And the earliest account we have of that is Athanasius, who he writes this like tract saying only read these four books and don't read the rest of them. And
when did he write that?
This is like, I don't know, you should look it up to be sure, but I think we're looking at like 3rd or 4th century.
So around the time of the Council of Nicaea?
Yeah, so one big misconception is that the Council of Nicaea like set the scriptural canon. That's not true. That might be Da Vinci Code inspired, I think.
Yeah, well, there's stuff in there that's also fictional.
They didn't... It's not... Look up Athanasius canon or something. Athanasius.
Oh, I can't spell that.
Spelling is not Alessi's strong suit.
Athan Athanasius. There you go.
There we go, thank you.
Yeah, Alessi kills it on our channels with titles and stuff. And he's extremely smart, but like he and I joke behind the scene, the one thing he can't do is spell. He has some interesting
I'm pretty bad at that too,
spellings.
actually. I'm really, really bad at spelling, especially doing it out loud. But yeah, you can see he's 3rd and 4th century. So it will have been in the 4th century, like early 4th century, that he writes this tract. And it might even say something there about it. I'm not sure, but
and you're saying that at the Council of Nicaea, that was not scripturally where they defined
Council of Nicaea was about determining like church doctrine, specifically like relationship
Jesus
of all of this kind of stuff. Like what is this Jesus stuff actually about? the canon is a separate thing, and it might have been determined earlier or elsewhere, but the earliest version that we have is Athanasius saying, only read these 4 texts. And so after this, what probably happens is some kind of suppression or like virtuous destroying. Like people might do it of their own accord because they're not supposed to be reading these other texts, but these other texts sort of fall out of fashion. They're not spread around. They sort of exist in different esoteric groups, and there are some like smaller groups that have cropped up with their own scriptures and stuff, some which are more popular and travel around, but for whatever reason, they end up sort of getting like lost. Either they're destroyed or people just forget about them or whatever. We just don't have them. But we know that they exist because in the 4th century, in the 2nd century, Irenaeus is an early church father who writes a text called Against Heresies. And this is a huge, huge text which basically argues against every single Christian heresy which he knows exists, and sort of says why it's wrong, why you shouldn't believe this, why you shouldn't believe that. And he's writing about these other views. He's writing about a gospel of Judas, and so we have Irenaeus's work, and we know that he's writing about this gospel, but we don't have the gospel. And so for the longest time, all we knew about these texts was through their enemies. And you can learn a thing or two, but obviously it's always going to be skewed if you don't have the original literature. Then in the 1940s, there is a teenage farmer in the desert in Egypt, near a place called Narkomadi. And he's digging in the desert, and he comes across this jar. And he's scared to open it at first because he's scared it's got a jinn in it, like a devil, right? Yeah. He's terrified to open it. And eventually it gets opened up, and there's a bunch of old like papyrus in there. And so the story goes, like he takes it home, and his mother uses some of the papyrus to like feed the fire, Yeah, and eventually it's sort of it's realized that these are sort of worth something. So It's a bit of an insane story, actually, and I don't know all of the details, but this is where a lot of our Gnostic literature comes from. And so we've got there these like Coptic translations. Coptic is an Egyptian dialect, and there's Coptic translations of Gnostic texts. So the Gospel of Thomas, for example, the Gospel of Judas actually isn't in this text, but the Gospel of Thomas is, for example, probably the most famous Gnostic gospel, although it might not even be Gnostic. And it's our only copy that we've ever found of this gospel. And so just by chance, this guy happened to find this jar, and now we have
And they didn't
Gospel of
burn
Thomas.
that one for papyrus.
No, that one was not burned. Interestingly, the Gospel of Judas, which was found not as part of this collection, but nearby.
Oh yeah, that has some burn marks.
Yeah, you can see. Look at that. So look underneath. See that one down there. That's the Gospel of Judas, right? So this is found in a different. I think it's found nearby, but it's not found in the Narkomadi library. And the Gospel of Judas, this spends a long time in private hands because people are trying to sell it. Like people really want to sell this. And so I can't remember when this is discovered. I think it's discovered maybe in like the 70s or 80s or something. And it spends like decades. It might have been slightly earlier than that. Maybe you can look that up actually to be sure. Just if you click on the Gospel of Judas. It spends decades traveling around, private sellers trying to sell it. The thing about Egypt is it's got the perfect climate for the preservation of papyrus. That's why these things last for so long, and that's why we always find them in Egypt, because it just happens to have the perfect air to make sure that these things don't disintegrate. Someone takes the Gospel of Judas, and for example, it spends about 16 years in a safety deposit box in New York City, which almost destroys it.
16 years?
Something like that, yeah. It might have been more like 10 or 15.
How did it get to New York City?
Because people are moving around trying to sell it. Somebody's trying to find a buyer, because this thing is absolutely like golden. Like this is an unbelievable gospel, right? And it's huge, and it's going to change the whole face of New Testament scholarship, right? Eventually, National Geographic buy it and publish it. I think they publish it in like 2006 or something like that. So it's been going around for decades, and it's only like at the turn of the millennium that finally the Gospel of Judas is available for people to read. But it's a crazy story. And here's the really weird thing, man, is that like people think, why? So the Nag Hammadi library, again, that's not where the Gospel of Judas is found, but people want to ask the question, like, why was it buried in the desert? And so one popular suggestion was, well, when Athanasius said only read these 4 Gospels, the rest of them are buried, either to hide them or keep them secret, or because they've been condemned, get rid of them, put them in the desert. And that's the theory for the longest time. But then there's this whole weird story about how the farmer boy mentions that there was like a corpse, and his older brother is like, no, there was no corpse. I don't know what he's talking about. And so there is this suggestion that this was actually a grave robbing, because it was quite common to bury like papyrus, like documents, with people who died. And so there is an idea that these guys were out there trying to rob a grave, and they happened upon this expensive set of papyrus. And
Do we have speculation of whose grave it could have been?
I don't think we have an idea of whose grave it could have been, no, because we don't know much of the details. I'm not even sure if we know the exact location where it was found, because it was just, like I say, some teenage farmers in a desert. But so it's this extremely strange and slightly shady story of how it's all discovered, because
I'll say.
There's something about like a blood feud. I think there's some cannibalism in the story there somewhere, to be honest. It's like a whole...
They're just hitting every single keyword.
It's like a whole thing. And yeah, I mean, the story is really crazy. But so some people have shifted from thinking, well, they were buried there because of Athanasius's declaration, and then it's like actually they were buried with somebody as part of their like burial properties. There's probably a word for it. I forget what it's called, but like ceremonial burying people with their documents, and that they were trying to rob a grave, and then they came across them, and it's all a bit of a mess. But eventually, we have access to all of these ancient Gospels, and like I say, we knew that these existed. But now we have the texts themselves. So the Gospel of Judas is one of my favorites. When does it say it was discovered or rediscovered?
That has been carbon dated to 20 AD.
So notice it says, given that it includes late 2nd century theology, it's widely thought to have been composed in the 2nd century, brackets, prior to 180 AD by Gnostic Christians. It's been carbon dated to 280 AD, plus or minus 60 years. So how do we know that it's prior to 180 AD? Because that's when Irenaeus wrote Against Heresies, and he mentions the Gospel of Judas. So we can carbon date it to 280 AD plus or minus 60 years.
And then use the previously known information.
But that's this copy that we have, right? Which is a Coptic translation. So when was the text originally written? Well, it's been mentioned. So there are multiple ways that we can sort of date documents.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.